In this episode, I am going to go over all the things I use to solder white metal and give you a demo on how I do that. So if that's something that interests you, stick around and see how it's done. Alright, today I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I solder white metal, and maybe it'll inspire you to give it a try on your white metal kits. You know, if you've been watching my channel, obviously I build a lot of model Factory Hiro stuff, so that's what I'm using for my example, but this will work on pretty much any white metal. Not really a demo on how to solder brass or copper or anything like that. That's a little bit different. I might do another video on that, but for now we're just going to talk about white metal and go over a few of the things you need to do that. So, you know, obviously right off the bat you need something made out of white metal to solder white metal. So first thing we need, second thing we need is flux. So in this case, and what I recommend is a liquid flux. It's an acid-based flux, so it acts to clean the metal, and then it also acts as a heat sink to draw the heat and the solder into the joint. So I'll demo how to use the flux. Before we get into that, like I say, it's an acid. It's not a super strong acid, but it's acid nonetheless, so a bit of caution needed with using this stuff. If you get it on your skin, you'll feel it'll burn a little bit, depending on which one you got. Depends on how severe the burns are going to be, but it will burn you, so use some caution there. If you get it on you, just go wash it off immediately with a bunch of water, and flush your skin or whatever. So there's the flux. I'm not really, I'm showing you what I use. I'm not necessarily endorsing any particular brands or products. There are others out there. This is, as you can see, it is what it is. Same with my solder. So the solder I use, though, is 70 degree, 73 specifically degree, so that's Celsius, melting point solder. Made specifically for white metal. You can't really use normal solder like lead tin solder. It doesn't really work very well for white metal. I think you can do it. I've never actually tried. Actually, that's not true. I have tried, and it didn't work. It kind of sticks to it, but not really. You really need the right solder for it, and a couple reasons for that. The super low melting point helps a lot. Because melting point of white metal it's still higher than like lead tin solder, but not much higher. So there's a really big risk of melting your white metal if you don't use a low temperature solder. So anyways, it typically comes in sticks like this, or in a little brick, a little ingot. And again, brand agnostic. This is what I got, so it's what I'm showing you. So not an endorsement, just what I got. So anyways, the best place to find white metal solder, low temp solder, it is kind of hard to find. It's a very specialized thing. But the model train sort of genre, it seems to be the best bet to find it. So a model train shop, especially a model train shop that sells, because white metal model train stuff will typically have it. So there's a few out there. This is the first place that I reliably knew had good stuff. That's why I got it from here. This is from England. I'm in Canada, so it cost me a bit to get this shit shipped out to me. Since then I found there's another place in Toronto down east that sells it, so it is available. You just got to look around for it. Yeah, so that's your best bet, though. Model trains places seem to be the best bet. Next thing you're going to need is a soldering iron. I just have this one out on my bench because it was the easiest to show on the video. This is the one I have used this to solder white metal. It works just fine. This is a handheld. It's not, so it just the iron plugs straight into the wall. It's not a soldering station, but this one in particular, this is a Hako FX600. These are really hard to get a hold of. I had to get this one out of Japan. I didn't buy it to do white metal. I bought it for other stuff. But I got it for its portability. But this one is temperature adjustable. That's kind of important with doing white metal. It gives you a little bit more control. You can do it with fixed temperature irons, but what you want in an iron is something that I don't know what the actual wattage on this thing is. I think it's about a 21 watt iron. I don't know if it says on the heating element. But this is a ceramic heating element. This is the heating element itself. I think these are 21 watts. So this is essentially the same heating element, takes the same tips as the soldering iron I do use all the time, and that is I'll throw a picture of it up, but it is the FX888D soldering station. So it's got a separate power supply and then a plug-in wand for your soldering iron. So anyways, these are nice though. If you can find a soldering iron that has, and I'm talking anything, it could be a Weller or whatever, but one that has interchangeable tips. So here's the actual tip. You find ones that have interchangeable tips. That is really nice because then if the tip goes bad, you can change it. Adjustable temperature, ideal. Not necessary though, like a fixed temperature one would be fine. I'll talk about the actual soldering temperatures here in a bit. But these are ideal. And the reason they're really good is they got a high recovery rate. So that means that they heat back up quite quickly, and that's important. They don't lose a lot of temperature, so they can maintain a puddle essentially. And I'll demo that. What I mean by that. So that's important. But you don't need a big fancy soldering iron. These ones actually aren't. If you can find them, I guess I paid many years ago. I bought this, but it was around $70. So, considerably more than the cheap ones you get at, Harbor Freight or whatever, Princess Auto. But still not into the soldering station territory in prices. So it's a good alternative. Like if you can find something like this, really good soldering iron. Work for many different things, not just the white metal. So that's kind of nice about it. So a decent soldering iron, I think, is key. Especially if you don't know how to solder yet and you're just sort of learning. The worst thing you can do is try to learn how to solder with a shitty soldering iron. Soldering is one of those things that equipment matters, technique matters, process matters with soldering. It's not... It's just one of those activities or one of those things, one of those tasks that requires decent equipment. Like, yeah, you can solder with those shitty pistol grip soldering guns, but even if you know how to solder, they're difficult to use. So you get crappy soldering equipment and you don't know how to solder, it's a recipe for disaster, especially when dealing with white metal. So anyways, just my recommendation. I'm sure there's lots of guys out there that could do this with a propane torch, or at least they can say they can do it with a torch. So anyways, your mileage may vary, but that's my recommendation, is buy the best you can afford. And also, weigh how much you're going to use it. But But yeah, these are good. Weller makes some good soldering irons and good soldering stations. There's many out there, but you know, a decent name brand one, that's the route I would go. So, anyways, that's the equipment. You know, like that's it. Soldering iron, some decent solder, and the flux. Those are the three most important things in the process. The next thing you're going to do is need something to solder together, and a camera that stays in focus. So these are already soldered. I'll show you in a few moments here. We'll go over to where I do my soldering, and I'll walk you through it. But before we do that, the next most important thing is prepping your parts for solder. So just like any other, you know, joining two things together, preparing them to do that is important. Right, all these things are soldered together. So the mating surfaces need to be clean, flush. Like the parts need to fit together well to begin with. You know, you can do a bit of gap filling with solder. It's not ideal though. You do want parts that fit together. So you got to prep your parts, get them fitting well, and you got to clean everything. That's the next most important thing, is cleanliness. Any metal oxidizes over time, so you have to remove that oxidation. That's part of what the acid core or the acid flux does. But the cleaner it is to begin with, the better, before you even get the flux on there. So that's your number one thing. Get the parts fitting together, clean them, and by that I mean like a clean, exposed, clean, fresh metal. So I usually take, you know, my sanding sticks, the mating surfaces, they'll get a bit of a file. They don't have to be super smooth. 400 grit's fine for that. And then sort of the edges, like that's the joint there that's been soldered already. Hopefully this is focusing. You know, so you can see it almost disappears. So, you know, I'll usually just, the outside edge, you know, surfaces, I'll give a quick wipe down with the sandpaper just to get exposed, clean, fresh metal. Mating surfaces do that. And then the next thing, which I don't have out on the bench, is you'll want something to hold your parts together. So clamps of some sort to hold the two parts together if possible. You can't always do that, like little tiny parts of bracket or whatever, you know, but if it's located well and it's got a tight joint and it's clean, that's the recipe for success. So do what you need to do to get the part fitting well and to get the part immobile, so it's temporarily fixed where it's supposed to be. Don't glue it. You don't want to contaminate that joint. So whatever you need to do is either tape works well. If you can tape the part but still access the joint, that's fine. It won't, the tape won't burn or anything like that, so you're no risk there. So yeah, that's what we want to do. So that sets us all up for actually doing the solder joints. You know, clamping's the best. I just use, you know, whatever kinds of clamps. You'll see I'll be using some here in a sec to solder all this together. So yeah, that's what you're going to need. You know, something soldered together, a good soldering iron, some decent solder that's made for white metal, so low temp solder, some flux, and the willingness to give it a try. That's the other thing, right? Maybe, you know, on Model Factory Hiro kits, they give you a ton of, you know, you always get these cutoffs, you know, of various pieces, you know, various shapes and sizes. So these are good to save, and or clip them off the kit you have, any scraps, and practice on these. But do the same thing, clean them up really well, bit of a sand and all that, get them fixed together, clamped together, and then practice. That's how you learn. So anyways, with all that being said, let's head over to the bench and I'll show you how I soldered everything up. So yeah, just before we go there, you can see these are two pieces soldered together. You can see the solder joint right there, barely. Right there, there's a little bit of a step, and you can see this is kind of oval shaped, so now I can work this to be round. And then once I get this cleaned up and round, then I gotta solder these on. So yeah, this is sort of the end result. This is what we're looking for, is this particular piece. There was an insert that went inside here that I soldered in. The hubs, 2 separate pieces, joint down the middle obviously, or maybe not obvious, but joint down the middle, which I soldered together. These I will clean up in my lathe because I want that joint to be gone, and I want this to look like it's a machine piece. So that's what I'll do with those. I soldered these caliper halves together. So yeah. Yeah, it's a really handy tool to have, I think, for white metal. It's stronger than CA glue, so that's one of the big benefits of it. It's got good joint filling, gap filling, maybe not gap like big gaps, but it will fill the joint completely. So it'll add a bit of strength to the part. It's essentially the same material. Once you get it joined, it sort of unifies the part to be not quite one. It's not welded together, but close enough. So when you work this, sand it down, clean it up, you can polish this now, and it polishes very similar to the base metal, so it's not very noticeable. So that's a big advantage of it, is you can fill a joint on something that you're going to polish, or machine, like I'm going to do on these. I'm going to machine them. I'll probably paint these. I don't know if I'll leave them a natural finish, but regardless, I'll machine them, and it'll look like, even when I paint it, it'll look like a continuous one-piece machined hub. So that's the advantages there. And really, once you get the hang of it, it's super easy to do. In my opinion, it's better than gluing it together with CA glue. And gives you way more versatility. So anyways, let's head over to to my spray booth, and I'll demo how I soldered all this stuff up. So back in a bit. All right, so as we just talked about, I'm going to demonstrate a bit of the soldering. So again, I think I showed this already, the Flux low temp solder. My soldering station is over here with a fairly tiny tip on it. So I think we've already talked about, prepping everything, get it all clean. I file the mating surfaces and get it quite clean. And then I just apply the liquid flux to the joint. I want the joint wet, but I don't want to get flux all over, because essentially solder will stick where the flux is. That's part of its job. So I just oops, that's a bit much. I usually solder white metal by getting the solder on the tip and then bring it into the piece. That's not how you solder like electrical, but and then just run it along the joint. As you can see, it goes pretty quick. It's a function of how hot I have my iron. I have my iron at 550 degrees Fahrenheit. And I have it that hot so that this solders really quickly, you know. I don't want to be on the material for very long. And if you got a lower temperature set on your iron, it's hard to, and you're on the material for a long time. What happens is you start getting the material really hot because it's a big heat sink. So the heat's just wicking away from the joint, and just instead of getting the joint hot enough to solder, it just spreads out. So then you end up getting the part really hot, and then you run the risk of melting the part. So having a really hot iron actually reduces that risk. So hopefully you saw that. I'll flip this one over. Parts like this, where you got multiple solder operations to do on the same part, it's super important to keep it clamped, because you don't want the joint I just did on the other side to come undone when I add heat to do this side. It's kind of another reason why you don't want to just slather a bunch of flux on here either, because if it runs down, because it's a liquid flux, or any flux, it's a really good heat conductor. Right, so if it's all run down to the other joint, it's just going to carry all that heat with it to the other joint. So, you want to pretty much keep it where you want the solder. And that's it. So again, I just picked up some solder, and then I'm just bringing it along the joint. I'll go over and refloat a couple times just to make sure I get penetration. Something like this where I can't really get to the back side of the joint. Not ideal, but it still works. It just means you have to work it a bit more on the outside of the joint. Typically, if I could get to the inside of the joint, I would actually start soldering on the inside face and apply most of my solder there, and then wick it through from the outside, just using the iron to draw it through. But here I don't really have that luxury, but I want to make sure I get enough solder on there that I fill the joint. And this one I'll need to do a little bit of work to make this all disappear. So I want to make sure I have enough solder built up on the surface that I can use it as a filler. That's sort of the other great advantage here. Not only have I joined the parts together, but I've also filled the gap and added some body filler, essentially. So there is both sides of that done. So that's step one. These are the exhaust pipes for a motorcycle. So there's they're megaphone. So there's the cone that'll go on this end and the pipe that'll go on this end. And I'll solder them on as well. I won't show them in this. Maybe I will. We'll see. I have to go do some prep work. So the pieces were not quite the same length. One piece was shorter than the other, so I need to, do some more prep work before I can solder the other pieces on. So, but anyways, there is that one done. So that's a good demo of, I don't know, it's a fairly fine piece. It's fairly thin, and I think that's a good demonstration that even with a super hot iron, I didn't risk melting this, provided I had the joint super wet, or wetted well with flux. It was clean before that. The joint was fairly tight, and I come in with a hot iron and I move quickly. Like, I'm not sitting there, and I'm not putting any pressure on the part either. I'm just touching it on there and then drawing the solder in with the heat. and it does its job. So that's a good demo for that one. What else do I got here? I've got same project. These are 2 halves of a wheel hub. So the joint is in the middle here. So I want to solder these 2 together. Because I want this joint to disappear. I'll probably put this in the lathe when I'm done. And machine it. And then the joint where I soldered will disappear. So again, just load my tip up with solder. In this case, I want it to really penetrate and fill, and I don't really care if I get a bunch of buildup on the outside. So I'm not too worried about using too much solder. So I got a lot of solder on here. And I'm just going to work it into that joint. Bring it around. Hopefully you can see this. And again, like I said, I'm going to finish this afterwards in the lathe, so I'm not too worried about how pretty this looks or if it's a little lumpy. Which allows me to be fairly liberal with the amount of solder I'm using. That one I kind of messed up, but it's okay, I can fix it. I don't know if you can see that, but I got a lot of solder where I didn't really need it at all, but you can just work it around. I got a bit of a lump on here, but sorry, it's off camera. I was just looking at it. Yeah, that's the that's that hub soldered together. So I'm happy with that. Yeah, so that's about it. Well, here we got another example. So I don't know if you can see here what's going on. So this is 2 pieces. They cast, this is a fork tube for a motorcycle. So they cast the main piece with a groove out of it, probably to minimize or to reduce the amount of material in the single casting, so it wouldn't warp or shrink too much. And then there's an insert in there. Now these parts I want to polish when they're done, so I essentially need this joint to disappear. So soldering is the best way to do that. Again, once I clean this up, I'll essentially have some solder lines. And this solder, when you polish it, pretty much looks exactly the same as the white metal. So it'll essentially disappear, even on an unpainted component. It's important to keep your tip clean as well. So I got a wet sponge here, and I got sort of like a Brillo pad type of deal. If I got really heavy buildup. to clean the tip in. This joint's just sucking the solder down into it. So it's taken a bit to get it to fill all the way up to the top. This one I'm not too worried about. Again, the surface finish. I'm going to clean these up in the lathe. So if it's a little lumpy, I don't really care. Oops, if your clamp doesn't go flying. Yeah, you can just see that joint's just keeps taking the solder in, so a little bit of filling needed on this one. Not really a void in there, it's just a lot of surface area. So that should do it. You know, and once I go and clean this up, if I still got little lines there, because I want, like I say, polished aluminum, if there's still a divot, I'll just come back and run a bit more solder. So, and I think, I don't know if you noticed there, you know, it wasn't soldering very well, so I came back and put some more flux on, and then the solder started to flow again. You know, so if you run into that, where it stops sort of taking the solder, like it starts to beat up on the surface, that's because your flux is no longer effective. You know, the surface has become contaminated. It's oxidized from the heat, and then your flux is no longer protecting it, so that's what's happened. And it's common, especially when you go in a rework an area. It'll do that. So you just got to re-wet it with your flux, and it should be fine after that. So anyways, there is a quick demo of actually doing the solder. So we'll head on back to the bench and maybe just talk a little bit more about and review the process and the tools and so forth. So anyways, I'll see you back at the bench. All right, before I head back to the bench, actually, I just wanted to demo soldering some smaller parts. So these are the calipers. I've gone ahead, I've got them all prepped and clamped together. Again, pretty important, much like, you know, any other assembly process. It's 90% of it is the prep work. That's where the success is born, is in the prep work. So the mating surfaces cleaned up, got them, you know, so that they'll go together quite well. In this case, I don't want to have a ton of excess solder. Can't really get to the back effectively, but I can get to the ends. which would be fairly easy to clean up. So, I'm just gonna let it wick in, and then just minimum solder, and just use the heat to draw it in. Again, these parts are fairly delicate, so there is a risk of melting some stuff, but if you're careful, it's and quick. It's not too bad of a risk. Again, why I would choose to solder these, I could have just super glued these together, use some CA. But I want this joint to disappear. So, or, as much as possible. It might not go away completely, but, filling these little joints in between the fins would be a little difficult. So, the solder acts as the filler. As well as the bonding material. So my fluxes, see there, the solder wasn't flowing into the joint, so it's usually a good indicator that your flux is dried out. I don't know if you can see that, but you can see it, the solder coming through the joint all the way back here, even though I didn't put any solder there. So that's the flux. Just pulls it through the joint. There. Yeah, so there's a tiny little part soldered. So I've anything that can be soldered can be soldered. If you know what I mean, like from the tiniest little piece to great big pieces. You can solder them all together, really. Obviously, you can't solder after you've painted something, so the only time you can really solder is when it's in the bare metal state. So I usually try to do sub-assemblies like this. Is all obviously the same color, so this is where ideal to solder. And it's more robust. That's the main reason why I like to solder. It's more robust, and then you can work it without any fillers. So anyways, there's that. Let's head back to the bench. All right, so there we go. A little demo of me doing some soldering. Hopefully the footage turns out decent. It's kind of hard to solder or to film in my spray booth, and I don't think I touched on that. The reason I do my soldering in the spray booth is for the fume extraction. So obviously the fan's going, it's getting rid of any fumes. I don't really notice fumes when I'm soldering white metal with the low temperature, but I'm using acid. I don't want to take any chances. If you're doing normal soldering, electrical or brass or copper or whatever, you definitely want to be getting rid of the fumes. They're not good for you. They are harmful, so you want to get those out of there. You want to be soldering in a well-ventilated area. So anyways, that's out of the way. That's why I do that. So what we got in front of us is this is obviously, those are motorcycle parts. This is a project I'm working on at the moment. And this is just to show you after I've cleaned up the solder joints. So this whole frame, all these joints here, that was a lap joint right there, so it's completely disappeared. This tube is soldered. It was a butt joint there, so that's soldered. This is, get the wire out of the way. This is soldered all around here. So this A-frame, the down tubes are soldered to the headstock. So all that's done with soldering. I soldered in, talking about small pieces, these little gussets, they're soldered in. And as you can see, that's quite small. It's about 3 mil across, and it's quite thin. It's about 1/2 mil thick. No problem soldering that. What else is soldered on this thing? Like that tab right there is soldered onto the frame. It was molded as part of the master cylinder. I cut it off and I soldered it to the frame, and other little various bits and pieces. But yeah, a lot of solder work on this frame. Most of it, well, all of it is soldered together. It originally it's screwed together. There was screw holes right there, right there. You can kind of see actually after I worked it, I put a brass tube in there, or a copper tube. Brass, probably brass, I can't remember. But I ran a brass tube all the way through, and it was hollow, and then I flared it so it crimped everything together, and then I filled that with solder. So white metal solder doesn't really stick to brass very well, but you know, for a case like this, you can do some filling, and it will fill around the brass pretty good. So anyways, that is that. I hope that provided you some insight and maybe some inspiration to go give soldering white metal a try yourself. You don't need much in terms of tools. You know, you do need a soldering iron. I suggest getting a decent one that's temperature adjustable. You do need specialty solder and flux. Other than that, you just need the courage to give it a whirl. You know, it's not that hard. Really, it's all technique. Once you get the technique, like I demonstrated, it is extremely easy actually, and it solders extremely well. If that's not happening, stop. Figure out what's going on. Figure out why solder is not flowing into a joint. Figure out why the solder is not wetting the surface. And when we say wetting when you're soldering, that means that the solder is flowing over the base material, and you know, visibly you can see it sticking to it. It's not just beating up and creating little blobs. If it's blobbing and it's looking like some sort of booger weld thing going on, stop, because something's wrong. It's either not clean enough, or it'd be not clean enough, not prepped properly, or you're using the wrong flux in solder. So stop, reevaluate, figure out what's going on, fix whatever it is, and then try again. Don't try to force it. You know, like, you should not ever be putting a bunch of pressure on something thinking that that's gonna magically make, you know, beat it into submission to stick together. That's not the way soldering works. You should just be touching it, right? Like, that's, you can see, it's hard to convey how hard you're pushing on something, but that's how hard I push on the material. I don't push. It's just basically the weight just resting on there. That's it. If that's not working, something's wrong. Stop, evaluate what's going on. You know, if it means you have to clean everything again, give it a bit of a scuff up, a sand, a wash, whatever. Do it, reapply your flux, and try again. You know, like I showed you in that demo, I run my soldering irons at 550 degrees Fahrenheit. That's super hot for white metal. White metal melts at about, I think it's 240. So about twice the temperature of the melting point of the white metal. So if your solder's not flowing with that, there's something wrong. And if you sit there and jam your soldering iron into the part and you stay on it for a whole bunch of time, you're going to melt the part, and that's not a good time. So like I say, hopefully you got the information you need to give it a whirl and go in with a bit of confidence and discover how to do this. It's I think a great way to join white metal together. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you got something out of it. If you did, let me know. Or if you got another way of soldering white metal that works for you, throw a comment down below. Let everybody know. I'm sure others would appreciate that. So with that all said, take care. Bye-bye.